Welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. We'll start where the noise level jumped overnight: Ukraine's energy grid. And this is very much a continuation, not a reset, of what we discussed previously. Late Sunday into early Monday night, Russia ended whatever ambiguity remained around the so-called energy pause. We talked yesterday about how Moscow had eased off some grid targets while still hitting transport and civilian infrastructure. The update is that restraint is now fully gone. Russia launched its largest combined missile and drone strike of 2026, just hours before the next round of U.S.-brokered talks in Abu Dhabi. Roughly 70 missiles and about 450 drones were used in one package, and the emphasis shifted decisively back to heat and power. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Vinnytsia. Combined heat and power plants, substations, and thermal facilities were the main targets. In Kyiv alone, more than 1,000 apartment buildings lost heat. In Kharkiv, authorities said more than 200,000 people were left without heating as temperatures dropped below -20 Celsius. That timing matters. This wasn't about military necessity. It was about leverage, plain and simple. If yesterday's takeaway was Russia never stopped applying pressure, today's update is Russia turned the pressure dial all the way back up. Ukrainian officials are being very direct about what this means. President Zelensky said Russia used the brief pause to stockpile missiles, then came back with a strike package about 50% larger than recent attacks. Energy companies called it the most damaging strike of the year so far. The pattern is familiar: pause, posture, punish. But the scale is what's new here. All of this is happening as talks resume in Abu Dhabi, and the diplomatic tone from Moscow hasn't softened at all. This is another area where today is more underline than headline. Russian officials reiterated again that Western security guarantees for Ukraine are unacceptable. No European troops, no stabilization force, no NATO-adjacent presence of any kind. Foreign troops, in Moscow's words, would be legitimate targets. We've heard this before, but the timing matters. This messaging is clearly aimed at killing momentum behind the enforcement frameworks that Ukraine, Europe, and the US have been quietly aligning on. Yesterday, we talked about those multi-tiered enforcement ideas moving from theory to planning. Today's update is Russia responding by slamming that door shut publicly. Territory remains the core sticking point. Moscow continues to demand that Ukraine give up the entire Donbass region, including areas Russia still hasn't fully taken after 4 years of war. Kyiv has not budged on that. Ukrainian officials have floated alternative arrangements: demilitarized zones, sequencing, monitoring, but not outright surrender. That gap hasn't narrowed, and nothing in the last 24 hours suggests it will. Layered into this is nuclear signaling, and this is where the calendar really matters. The New START treaty expires this week, and Russian officials are making sure no one forgets it. Moscow is publicly emphasizing that its nuclear triad is fully modernized and that Russia can guarantee its security from all sides. President Putin has said Russia could stick to New START limits for another year, but only if the US does the same, and only in the context of broader negotiations. This is classic linkage. Ukraine on one hand, arms control on the other, all mixed together to see what concessions shake loose. This isn't new behavior, but the update is how overt it's become as talks approach. Russian media and officials are clearly leaning into the idea that escalation ladders are very real and very tall. It's the geopolitical equivalent of leaving a loaded prop on the negotiating table and insisting everyone stay calm. At the same time, Moscow is still floating economic incentives. Russian officials have publicly suggested expanding cooperation with the US on hydrocarbons and critical minerals, framing Russia and the US as great powers with shared interests beyond Ukraine. That pitch hasn't changed, but it's becoming more visible as Russia's economic pressures mount. And those pressures are becoming harder to hide. Even Putin has acknowledged that Russian GDP growth slowed to about 1% last year, down sharply from earlier wartime highs driven by defense spending. At the start of January, the government raised the value-added tax, pushing more of the war's cost onto ordinary Russians. Official inflation numbers remain optimistic, but independent reporting continues to show sharp food price increases. Oil and gas revenues, still the backbone of Russia's budget, fell significantly last year and are projected to fall again in 2026. This ties directly into another update we're watching closely: India. Over the weekend, U.S. officials said Prime Minister Modi agreed in principle to reduce purchases of Russian oil. The Kremlin quickly said it had received no formal notice, which is diplomatic speak for "we're concerned but hoping it doesn't stick." If India really does scale back imports, that hits Moscow's war financing at exactly the wrong time. This isn't a confirmed shift yet, but it's a meaningful data point to watch. While all of that plays out at the strategic level, Russia is still adapting on the tactical and hybrid fronts. Ukrainian officials reported that Russian forces are now using long-range drones, specifically Gerbera drones, as motherships to carry smaller FPV drones hundreds of kilometers into the Ukrainian rear. This expands the threat well beyond the front lines and complicates air defense planning. You don't want to burn high-end interceptors on tiny drones deep in the rear, which means Ukraine needs more point defense and interceptor drones. This is a technical adjustment, but it has strategic implications because it stretches already thin defenses. The gray zone picture around NATO hasn't gone quiet either. During the February 3rd strike, Poland scrambled fighter jets to secure its airspace. Separately, an unidentified drone crashed near a Polish military facility responsible for electronic reconnaissance and monitoring the Suwałki Gap. Authorities said they couldn't intercept it and haven't publicly named an actor, but the context speaks for itself. Add to that a recent cyber attack on Polish energy facilities timed during winter conditions that investigators say likely involved Russian-linked hackers. Energy again. Pressure again. On the battlefield itself, there's continuity more than change. Russian forces made small advances near places like Pokrovsk and Sloviansk, mostly using infantry-heavy assaults supported by drones and glide bombs. No breakthrough, no collapse. Ukraine continues striking Russian electronic warfare systems, drone production sites, and troop concentrations in occupied territory. The update here is that the fight remains grinding and expensive for both sides, with no sign of rapid movement despite Moscow's political messaging. Zooming out, the overall picture hasn't flipped, but it has sharpened. Russia showed up to peace talks having just launched its largest strike of the year, frozen tens of thousands of civilians, rejected security guarantees, and reminded everyone that nuclear escalation is always lurking in the background. That's not accidental, that's positioning. Ukraine showed up battered but coordinated with its partners, pressing for air defense, enforcement mechanisms, and guarantees that actually mean something if Russia violates a future ceasefire. This isn't a breakthrough moment. It's a leverage-building moment. And right now, Moscow is leaning hard on the same tools it's used for decades, from the Soviet era through Syria to today: pain, pressure, and the assumption that time favors the side willing to absorb more damage. Thanks for listening and being part of the RH community. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star review. If you want to see some changes, email us at info@restrictedhandling.com. We also publish a daily written intel brief on Substack, where you'll find even deeper coverage of Russia and China, along with insights on Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK.